Hey Zaka family! Zaka is launching an exclusive membership platform to provide you with career development workshops, coaching, community, and so much more. Go to ZakaConnect.com and sign up to receive information on how to access early registration and perks. Hello, everybody. This is Paul Herman, the Prince of Motivation and host of Zaka Presents My Journey. We're creating this vulnerable and positive platform where you can get inspired and motivated from different leaders from our community. Today, our guest is Azher Ahmed, who is a marketing technology executive. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
The pleasure's all ours, young man. I'm looking forward to hearing about your journey at Octagon and all the things you've done in corporate America. But I want to kind of just dive in a little bit more and kind of hear a little bit about your cultural background and where you're from.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I'm a first generation immigrant. My parents were from India, Pakistan. Kind of that whole partition wasn't very long ago, but basically the subcontinent. And I came here when I was 3 years old, and grew up on the north side of Chicago. Grew up poor. And
Chirac.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the north side was kind of rough in the '80s when I was growing up, but it was a fun sort of a time to be alive. And between the city and the suburbs, I kind of grew up in the Chicago metro for most of my youth.
Mm-hmm. Now, did you notice? Obviously, you were pretty young at the time. Did you notice like the difference in between like growing up where you're from and then growing up in Chicago?
Yeah, I have no real recollection of Pakistan because I was 3 when I came. I got to go back for the first time when my brother-in-law was getting married, and realized how American I am when I went there. But growing up in the city, it was pretty diverse. It was predominantly a Latino Puerto Rican neighborhood, lots of diversity in the city growing up. So it was nice. The first time I really ever felt any sort of culture shock was when we moved out to the suburbs. The city got a little rough. I think my dad was robbed at knife point for the second time, which was our little catalyst to say, okay, we should probably go somewhere else. So when we moved out to the suburbs, the suburbs of Chicago had a lot of that sort of white flight and whatnot. And that was the first time I was kind of surrounded by people that were predominantly white, and really noticed a little bit of okay, yeah, maybe there's something here that, I didn't really kind of think about or register, but there's certainly a little bit of a difference there. For me, again, it was I didn't know what it was at the time, but it certainly felt like, okay, yeah, this is a different vibe than what I grew up with.
Now, you mentioned Chicago. Was there a reason for it? You already had family in the States, or was this something that your parents just said, we're going to Chicago?
Yeah, so my dad's brother was out here. So my uncle, we kind of stayed with him up in the northwest suburbs for a little while. And then, we did have not much family, but then most of the family, my side and hers, ended up, my wife's side ended up moving out. There's a large sort of a brown Pakistani Indian community here.
Okay, good.
Yeah, so that was kind of the whole, impetus for kind of staying in this area for sure.
Now, a key thing that always happens on our show, our guests are very prideful of like where they're from and their culture. What does your culture mean to you?
Yeah, culture is an interesting thing. I'd say, I was, being a first generation American, Pakistani American, being Muslim. There were many lenses, I guess, to my identity that I didn't really connect the dots with until probably college. I think for me, it was the melting pot of just kind of, I'm here and I'm just hanging out with my buds and we're doing whatever we're doing. And then I started to learn a little bit more about my culture, and learn a little bit more about my faith. And the interesting thing, I guess, with my faith, with Islam, is it is such a diaspora of different cultures. You've got Arab cultures, you've got African cultures, you've got South Asian, Far East Asian sort of cultures. You had converts, many of which were that I met at the college level, and it's like it helped me to kind of understand a little bit more about my faith, but also helped me understand the fact that I felt always like a bit of an outsider of what is my culture? Like, I'm an American, I'm a Muslim, I'm an Asian, I'm all of these things. But it's very much sort of an identity that was starting to be formed. And what's interesting is I joined a Muslim Student Association to kind of learn a little bit more, because I'd never actually hung out with like Muslims before,
Mhm, mhm.
or even Indians. There's maybe one in fourth grade that I kind of met when I was growing up on the north side. But that was when I really got to actually meet people that kind of had weird sounding names like me and had a lot of Z's in their names and things like that. So it was fun for me to kind of learn and be a little bit of an outsider and kind of understand a bit of what they were all about. But it also like reinforced for me the fact that we're all kind of figuring it out. Like their culture is very much a transient thing, right? And I'd
Mhm,
say
mhm, mhm.
for Asians and Muslims, South Asians, it's still something that's still forming here. What does it mean to be an American Muslim in that sense, right? Because you're an American, and I started to see a lot of really interesting back and forths, right? Of like when immigrant parents would see things that were wrong in society, it was like, oh, that's because it's America. But it's like, well, you're also here because it's also a great opportunity, right? So you see that sort of a lens. But the minority sort of complex versus the majority was an interesting sort of attention that I saw, and probably helped me as a marketer as I
Mhm,
started
mhm.
to get into some of this, of kind of recognizing kind of what is by design and default within how people communicate with each other.
Mm, okay, I like how you broke all that down right there. I think you when you mentioned about the whole thing about Chicago being like a melting pot, I could only imagine, still trying to find your identity, but being in a melting pot with so many different other cultures around you, and being like, okay, well, how do I identify myself? But as you did that, did you find it through your passion for digital marketing? Like, how did you develop that passion for digital marketing, that strategy?
For me, I think I was like 12 years old when, and this was like 1990, 91, something like that, when I got a computer. And it was an unusual thing. Not a lot of people had computers. My brother had like an old Commodore, but I actually got like a PC, an IBM PC clone. And for me, it was amazing because like, it was $3,000 and it was a lot of money. And my mom being kind of like the breadwinner. My dad, had some health issues. He ended up retiring, and my mom pretty much raised us in the sense of money. So money was always tight. But to put in the money and to be able to get a computer, I got it for my birthday. And I opened it up, I set it all up, and I immediately broke it. I did something running through the menu.
Oh
And
my gosh.
I didn't physically break it, but like it wouldn't work. And I
Mhm.
panicked. I'm like, oh my God, my mom bought this for me, and it was so much money, and here I am, and I broke it. But it was a liberating experience because I immediately went right back to it. I read everything cover to cover that came with it. I got into it and I fixed it. And that was like
Okay.
my little breakthrough of like these things that are still so foreign to me, and I love and I want to learn. I immediately broke it and I was able to fix it. And that was like, oh my God, okay, I can figure this out. Like the worst thing that could have possibly happened right away. And then from then
True,
on,
true.
yeah,
Well,
from then on,
well,
I'd say most.
maybe
I'm
you
sorry.
explaining to your mom that was probably gonna be the worst thing. Let's be
Yeah,
real right
well,
now,
yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. The fear of the past, for sure. Absolutely. But that was the thing, is that it liberated me in the sense of like, look, like I can do this. Like this is something that isn't as hard as it may have seemed to me like a week ago. It took me about a week to figure it out. But I think when I got back into it, like that was the curiosity and that was the sort of interest of like, okay, well, yeah, let me go into this rabbit hole. And so growing up, like so some kids get into like sports and they get into all kinds of different things. For me, I was always a bit of like an extroverted introvert. So like for me, I would be up all night just kind of messing around with the computer, figuring out different bits and pieces of it. And I'd say again, like it played to my favor, like as I started to get jobs in the later 90s that were like,
Mhm.
that I was like a 16-year-old that took, I went to like one of these staffing firms, the ones that give you like contract
Oh yeah,
jobs,
yeah, that's
stuff
right,
like
that's right.
that and stuff. So I was like 16 and I went in and I like, they give you your little like, okay, well, maybe you can go sweep some floors somewhere or whatnot. But they put me through like a test for like Microsoft Word and all of this stuff. And I scored 100% on everything. And they're like, we've never seen this, but we can't put you into an office because you're only 16. Right.
Mhm.
So for me, it was like, well, what do I do? So I went to go work for Best Buy and got to go work more and learn about hardware and all of that. But it's like, for me, like it was such an interesting time, I'd say culturally, where computing and data and digital, even it wasn't even in marketing, but it was like, it was a time to just great time to be alive and figure out how
Mhm,
these
mhm.
things are transforming what we're doing, gaming, all of these things were still in their infancy. So
True, true. And compared to where it is right now,
yeah, yeah,
it seemed it seemed it seemed to me that you had a very cool child, very creative and hands-on childhood. What are some of the the lessons you learned that you like implement in your professional life now?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say a big one was the one that I just mentioned in the sense of like, there's nothing that's broken that can't be fixed, right?
Okay,
And so
cool.
that's a big one that I think for me I carry to this day. It's about the long term sort of macro lens, right? Like, what is it that I think I want to be doing, and any sort of short term setbacks or any things that happen are just part of the journey, right? Like at the
Mhm.
end of it. So I think we tend to get paralyzed in certain moments, and fight or flight sort of kicks in on those fronts. But for me, it's about kind of keeping the long game in mind. And again, there will be bumps because that's what every journey has along the way. It's about just having kind of the temperament and the
Mhm.
mindset to kind of move through that.
Mm. And how did your educational background like shape your career?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. So I wouldn't say I'm proudly, but I am a college dropout, and not because I haven't done college. I've done plenty of college. I was 16 years old when I was a freshman in college. I was supposed to be a doctor, as most people in the South Asian continent are supposed to be, because your parents tell you got to be a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. So
Hmm.
I started to go down that path of like, yeah, of course I'll be a doctor, kind of fulfilling my parents' wishes. I got to like dissecting cadavers, and I realized this isn't for me. Like I didn't want to do that. And so I never kind of thought about like computers or digital or even marketing as a career path. But then I got to a point where in college, like I think I'd switched over to computer science. I was learning a lot about like hardcore programming and things like that. But even then, like the web was taking off. And I was seeing these things, and I was building, dumb little simple websites and stuff. But then I go to school and I see them teaching us like mainframes and compilers and like 1960s computing. And I saw this bit of a disparity of like, there's this whole industry that's being built here. There's what I'm learning in school. Let me go like take a job and try to see what I can figure out here. So like, while I think college and school is a very useful and great thing, if I had to go back, I'd probably be like a psychology major, just because I've learned so much about how humans think. In this sense, I ended up like at a job that would pay for my school. And then, once I started making enough money where I'm like, well, is this the thing for me? Because I was juggling and it was hard to juggle both. I ended up actually dropping out and just becoming, full-fledged, once you get to like six figures and whatnot, of like, I'll just do this now. And that was probably about 20 years ago. It's still in my bucket list to go back and finish off the degree at some point. But for me, like the college journey was great, socially, to be able to meet lots of different people. I still have friendships and relationships that I made, and it certainly was a rewarding thing. But I think as most people probably started to talk about it, maybe about 5 years ago, like there's a lot of debt you incur through this process, and a lot of pieces of just like, what is ultimately the value or the box ticking for corporate America to say that
Hmm.
somebody can
Hmm.
actually learn. Learning doesn't stop, through at the end of
Oh, true. No, of course.
and I'd say for me, yeah, it's different strokes for different folks at the end of the day. But for me, it was a great experience. But I ended up, obviously getting into this space and just kind of letting it rip,
Mhm.
about 20 years ago. So.
Now, you mentioned about the whole thing about the immigrant parents, which a lot of our guests have spoke about in regards to like you got to be an engineer, doctor, lawyer, one of those
Yep.
professions. Like, how did you feel, going back to them and expressing to them like, this is not what I want to do?
Oh my God. It was like I died almost. I think there's a lot of for parents, like I think and this is something I take, I have three little ones myself, not so little anymore. My oldest is 15, but I think it's natural for human beings to want the best for their children, right? In that sense. And I'd say through that lens of parenting, many parents probably over-index on thinking, I know what's best for my child, and therefore they'll kind of project what their method of success is for their children. I definitely felt that. Like, I think my mother, her heart was in the right place, and she lives with me. She's here. I take care of her, and I'd say like it's one of those pieces where like she was very forceful in kind of her opinion on what she thought I should do, and I didn't question it. I'm like, okay, yeah, of course, this is what people do, right? This is how it works.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
and especially, I don't know like how it is in other cultures, but I know in like South Asian cultures, the arts and creativity are generally undervalued. in that sense, because there's an emphasis on establishment and financial prosperity and all those things that tend to fall into that doctor, lawyer, sort of engineer path, of which there's incredible value societally for that. But
Sure. 100%.
the thought of like, hey, I want to go, become a graphic designer, or I want to do, like, I don't think it's that they don't encourage it. I don't think it's that they discourage it. They just don't encourage it enough, or at least my mom didn't, in the sense of like, hey, you know what, you love drawing, you love computers, maybe there's something here for you, in that sense. And that was just something that I had to kind of figure out on my own. And again, when I got to the point where like I think the money started to come in, I think that generally softened her stance.
Any immigrant parent be like, no, 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 that's not going down. But then, when you showcase to them, like, look, I could make it, because, like you said, they want you to be successful. They work very hard to come over here and provide an opportunity for you. So like, it's like, don't throw this away, please. There's a little lottery right over there,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'm sorry, just one real quick thing. Like, my dad was an architect, right? My mom had a master's degree, so they were very well educated, coming from the subcontinent over here. But then, to have the culture shock of coming here, and my dad was like, at the point where like he could have driven a cab because it was hard to find jobs here, in that perspective. So I'd say again, it is about kind of adaptability, right? At the end of the day, based on your circumstance, for sure.
Now, as a Muslim American, like, have you ever felt that like corporate structure or companies that you work for were like not inclusive enough for you? Like, and if so, like, can you like give an example of one of those?
Yeah, I would say, not to be too abstract about it or flowery, I guess, I'd say most corporate structures are exclusive by default. And by that, I mean that, I don't think that they necessarily are trying to discriminate or exclude certain people, but I think there's a formula that generally works for them and got them to the point where they've scaled up to several thousand employees. And it's hard for organizations to break out of their habits in that sense. So I don't think they're necessarily thinking about the socioeconomic sort of impact of why somebody might not have a degree because they couldn't afford it, or because certain conditions wouldn't do that. But I think because they view that as a prerequisite to being able to say, hey, this person can pay attention and stay committed to something and see it through, they equate that as being one and the same of a college degree in that sense. And likewise, when you look through like multicultural lenses, I don't think, like, in my view, at least, marketing agencies should be representative of the population that they serve, right? In that sense, I think they would very much like different opinions of people from different perspectives. I just don't know if, frankly, even some of the hiring managers are equipped to be able to deal with people that approach things fundamentally different than they do. So that's where I think the values tend to be misaligned, where the management structures and middle management structures tend to just say one thing, but not necessarily show people how on that perspective. And it gets very complex with large organizations in that perspective, which is why I think those diversity initiatives are definitely a great start. But they're a start.
That's right. I like how you put that. You put the stamp on that. It's a start. It's a start. It definitely is not the finish. Right, it's a start. It's a lot of work that needs to be done, but it takes a village to make that happen, and the right people as well too. As you move up the corporate ladder, you're able to kind of implement some stuff, bring some more people in. Now, when you left out of college, like what was like that first career? Like, how did you first get started? Like what did you take away from that moment in your time in your life?
Yeah, so my first real job, aside from like Best Buy or retail, was there was a .com that was starting up. I believe this was like 1997. It was called One Internet Corp. And their founder was a guy who found me through the local mosque. And I didn't meet him at the mosque. I was actually doing a flyer for an inner city group called the Inner City Muslim Action Network. They kind of help on the south and west sides of people that are obviously very underprivileged in many ways. So it's a humanitarian sort of a cause, but it was through the lens of Islam and Muslims. So I had done a flyer for them, and he found it at the mosque on a Friday prayer, which is kind of the congregational prayer. And he said, "Who did this?" And somebody told him that it was me. So he actually reached out to me, and I was a school kid, and he's like, "Hey, do you want a job?" And I'm like, "Okay, yeah, whatever. How much?" And then he called me, and he's like, "I'll pay for your college." I'm like, "Oh wow, okay, yeah,
wow." Okay.
I'm like, "Okay, wow.
One flyer gonna pay for the college? Okay, let's go."
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, "Yeah, okay, let's go do it." And so he hired me as a junior graphic designer for this internet.com. And he's like, it's a ground floor operation. I showed up on day one. He was moving in. There were boxes in the hallway. I helped him move the boxes, and it was like literally ground floor sort of thing. So like that was my first foray into corporate America through the lens of a company that started small and kind of grew from that point. So we ended up probably being about 20 people deep in my 2 or 3 years there. But I got to do everything. I was hired as a junior graphic designer. There was no senior graphic designer, but I got to do like systems administration, programming, pretty much everything that you would do at any tech startup from that perspective. And I think he was probably surprised that I was more than just a guy who could make pretty pictures on that perspective. But I'm very grateful for that opportunity to kind of help me figure out, well, yeah, here's me in an office setting being able to kind of thrive from that perspective. And that was very rewarding early on.
That's one of those things where like it's a hit and miss. Like when you leave out of a school institution and you're like, what's going to be my first job? And, but you definitely were in the right place at the right time. And
and I'd say going back to, the Muslim and the Islam angle, like, that was a cultural piece where it was like, again, I was just doing something as a volunteer to kind of help out with humanitarian causes. And I'd say, again, whether or not you believe in faith or religion, there was an interesting rhythm of life that brought that opportunity, and I'm grateful and continue to be grateful to everyone and try to pay that forward as well for people in the sense of just, I believe that we're in it for each other to help each other in those ways. And that was certainly what got me my start and something that I certainly can try to help anybody else on that perspective coming up. Yeah.
And something that I've noticed in our conversation, you talked about the fact of like learning, like even as a child, you fell in love with like taking in new information. I read in your bio, it seems that you're always learning new skills. Like, why is that important to you?
I feel like, going back to like adversity and growth, right? Like you either succeed or you learn. Otherwise you fail, right? So like you've got to be able to have that sort of a learning and growth mindset with everything you do. You're not going to succeed at everything you do. But again, in those moments of even successes, but certainly in those failures, you have to learn about, what would I do different? What would I do exactly the same? But it was just my context. The time was wrong. The circumstances weren't right. I think, looking inward and reflecting is something we tend to not do as much as we should. It's certainly a discipline I've had to learn to be able to kind of grow myself. But I'd say, there's constant opportunities for us to learn what to do and what not to do. And I'd say, again, being able to be a constant sort of a learner through your journey of life. And I think the older I get now, the more I realize it's harder to kind of stay humble because you can become very unintentionally arrogant about like, look, now I know how to do this. This is how you do this, how you do this, how you do it. But what I love about technology is there's always a new, better way to kind of do things. So it's like, I think, and then all of a sudden, wham, here comes something else. And it's like, oh yeah, yep, I was wrong.
That is technology for us, it's like it just constantly evolving. So that would help someone to kind of like, be a little bit more humble because they're like, oh, I don't even know that just came out.
One huge learning opportunity for me has been being married. My wife is the smart one in the family. She has a PhD in chemical engineering. And she said, when she graduated, she could confidently say, I don't know. And so for me, that was one of the things that was like liberating of like, yeah, like we don't have to pretend like we know everything. You can just say no, and then you'll learn.
True. And if you have the right people to help you learn, right?
Yeah.
That right environment, an inclusive environment, in which we were talking about a little earlier. Now, when you're in your profession, like what do you think is the most important quality you bring to your career? Like, and how has that helped you in like the roles that you've played?
Yeah, I'd say at my core, if I had kind of a superpower or strength, it would be that, my curiosity leads me into places that tend to be a little bit, difficult for certain people to follow. And my ability to communicate and articulate a thought in plain English certainly helps. So I can go deep and say, hey, you know what? Everybody's lighting up on this whole conversational generative AI, chat GPT, where's the world headed? And I can go in and get into the GitHub repos and look at the code and install it and play with it and say, okay, well, here is where this line of code might impact, an organization or a brand or some level of growth, and then ultimately translate that into revenue.
Mm-hmm.
For these companies. So that's kind of the two-pronged approach of like one, having the curiosity to go deep into some of these areas, but also having the horizontal sort of a breadth to be able to say, okay, well, this is what it means for your category, this is what it means to your marketing, or this is what it means to your technology or product map, are the things that have been pretty good vectors for me in the sense of my career path.
Mm-hmm. Now, in your career path, you work with Fortune 500 companies. Yeah, a lot of them in the industry. Could you recall like one of your proudest moments in your career, and like what did you actually accomplish during that time?
Yeah, there are so many, man. Like I usually my proudest moment is the most recent thing that I've done, because for me, it's always about, continuing to kind of push what you do. If I had to look back at it, um, one of my proudest moments was being part of a team that helped, my holding company when I was at Omnicom pitch and win the U.S. Army business. It was a 6-year battle. It was a 6-year pitch. I didn't mean battle. That was a Freudian slip, I guess, when I'm talking about the Army. But it was a 6-year pitch for us to, articulate how we could take on an organization the size of the U.S. Army and come up with kind of a best in breed sort of a solution for it. So there were many people involved, many sorts of long nights and weekends that were spent, but I had the good fortune of being the digital lead for that one, and it was probably the most Herculean effort I think that was put forward by us. So again, being able to kind of be there, speak to the generals, being able to represent the tremendous work that we had put forward, and some really interesting progressive sort of thinking on how we can kind of look at that was certainly one of my proudest moments for sure.
And could you tell us a little bit more about your time at DDB?
Yeah, DDB. I was at another agency, and then DDB called, and I didn't have a great read on DDB. Like the agency had some down years, but it was Chicago, and it was an opportunity for me to come home. And I thought, all right, well, I'll spend a year or two here and figure out where I go. I was there for 10 years, so lots of fond memories over that time. 10 years at any agency, I think, is very atypical. I thoroughly loved every minute of it. I'd say DDB is you're one of your top tier agencies. You get to touch pretty much everything from candy to insurance to McDonald's was a huge client. Got to work with a lot of these very large sorts of companies and the people, more importantly, within those companies that are responsible for kind of driving, growth and understanding how to adapt, sort of mass psychology. I'd say my last probably 5 years or so was kind of seeing a lot of what's called marketing science now kind of bubble up. Which is basically taking the scientific method of saying, look, I have a hypothesis and I want to use marketing to kind of prove it or disprove it and kind of adjust and adapt. So got to spend a lot. Some of my favorite moments within DDB were kind of being able to apply basic science to marketing in that sense, and using the wealth of data and technology and media that was out there for us to really kind of figure out, well, what is kind of the method to the madness of what people care about? It's applying a lot of psychology, cognitive sort of neuroscience, which would be like, what do people care about? What are some barriers to what they do? And really having a method to the madness of what I think was probably before marketing science was a lot of spray and pray, right? Like, let me put stuff out and hope that because you saw it 5 times, you'll act on it because of a frequency of communication, which was certainly better. It's better than nothing, but I think it's become tremendously more sophisticated. And that was certainly a ride that I rode through during my time at DDB. For sure.
And what is the difference for you? Like when you break it down, agency and company, like what's the difference between the two?
For employees or for culture, like there's so many lenses, I guess.
Like working for an agency or working directly for a company.
Yeah. I would say I've had a lot of friends that have gone back and forth, right? But I would say agency life is great if you like diversity of categories, diversity of businesses, you, like I said, working between candy and in financial services is a huge gap, right? So like, if you like to keep your tools sharp, if you love a challenge of how people buy things differently or different journeys, agencies are great in that. You also become very frustrated because you have to be able to switch modes very quickly, and be able to live in pitch land and be able to say, hey, well, this is what we think it might matter to some Web3 startup that's trying to do something here, versus somebody who's been an established business for 500 years or 200 years. If you do go to the business or the brand side, you got to really love what that business or brand is about, right? I would say as a marketer, while we certainly are good students of trying to become subject matter experts very quickly around our categories or whatever brands we're serving, you've got to be, when you're on the client side or the brand or business side, you have to be steeped in it, right? So like, if you really love, consumer packaged goods, you'll probably love working at those companies. But if not, you might hate life after a little while because that's all you do, right? Within that. So
it's definitely a hard thing to pick, whether you want the diversity or you, like you said, you really truly love, that business. You're like, this is the corporation, the company I want to be at, and I want to help develop it and grow it, But
yeah.
having a diverse, I want to say a group of things coming your way does help you advance as well too. Picking up different tasks, different skill sets that you wouldn't pick up, like you said, finance into candy. That's a massive jump. I think that does help an individual out. So that's something that obviously I know our listeners are definitely gravitating to. Now, from your experience, like how do you feel, in it as an immigrant professional? Like how do you leverage your cultural background?
Yeah, I'd say, I understand the minority sort of dilemma, right? Like being the person in the room that, maybe says, hey, you know what, like maybe there's this thought here that I'm the only one who can kind of represent that or share that, and knowing when to share it and how to share it, I think is one of the pieces that's helped me in my career, because I think sometimes, I end up in a situation where it's like there's just so many blinders that people have. Again, not by design, but I think by default. I think we tend to say that, hey, this is the right way to move forward. But I'd say, having the different lens of like, this is a different culture, being able to kind of having the good fortune of being able to travel and whatnot, and being able to represent that within those rooms and those meetings, I think certainly helps. Like I'd say, within marketing, one of the big movements that started probably five-ish years ago was the thought of, the evolution from multicultural marketing to what's called total market, right? So like, rather than treating my message as a versioning exercise of like, I'll go translate this to Spanish, or I'll go translate this to some, to some other language. The thought of now, okay, well, let me think about everybody as a total consumer, as kind of a mass audience, and then say, okay, well, here's an insight that may come from a Latino audience that would apply to a broader cultural lens, is one of those things that I think every marketer wants to be able to do and do more efficiently. But I'd say, being an immigrant and being somebody who understands, kind of the minority majority sort of complex in that sense, is just natively how I think and breathe. And I think digitally, you have to be kind of adaptable to different audiences, whether they be people with visual impairments or different things that just have to be accessible to different ways. So I'd say, digital is always inclusionary by default. And I'd say a lot of those things are now coming to the foresight with marketers in that sense, to be able to get them to understand, how I can talk to more people that are fundamentally different than maybe the upbringing that they've had. There's no substitute, I'd say, regardless of how much training you have and DE&I efforts and whatnot. If you don't have employees that have lived and walked that path, you're probably at a disadvantage.
True.
Yeah.
And what's been the toughest moment in your career? Like, how did you handle it? I mean, you work for a lot of companies. Like climbing that little corporate ladder. Like, what's been the toughest moment for you?
There's so many tough moments throughout. It's not all roses for sure. But I would say, the toughest moments for me tend to be like, when I've outgrown a company, or I think that I need to really push myself out of there. Like, it's a people business and I love people, right? Like at the end of the day. So the toughest part is being able to say, maybe I need to do something else. right? So I'd say, being able to make a clean break sometimes is the toughest part of like, how do I make sure that I can leave on graceful terms while at the same time leaving a door open that, hey, maybe this isn't going to work out, and I'd love to find a way back at some point. So I'd say, being able to kind of be real candid and open about where you think growth needs to happen. But sometimes, companies are holding vessels for us as talent within our career path. And I try to be very open and honest, even with my teams, of like, we're trying to make sure that anxiety is as reduced as possible. I'd love to be able to work with everybody forever, right? At the end of the day, but I'd say where things are so transient sometimes from that perspective that it's never personal on that, but just being able to myself be able to find that growth opportunity as well as for my teams. Like, I'm just happy that we get to spend some time together in some sort of a common cause and grow.
And you mentioned a key word, team. As an executive, like who has led, several teams before, like how important is it to you to have a diverse team, and why?
Oh, it's penultimate, right? Like I'd say early in my career, it was more by default, right? Like I'd say in the digital space, you had a lot of people that just kind of came up because nobody had done it before. So I ended up with probably some of the most diverse teams culturally, and through many sort of whether you look at even neurological spectrum. I'd say lots of people that tend to be technical or programmers probably have some sort of ADHD type traits or things that lead them into certain areas that make them savants at certain things that other people probably would have struggled with. So I'd say for me, diversity was very much default earlier in my career, and I think as I kind of evolved and started to see, frankly, the lack of diversity in some of these other teams, it's certainly been something that I've been pretty vocal about, saying that I think we need to be inclusive of these different opportunities. I think where corporate America struggles right now, in all candor, is just I think everybody wants to tick many boxes to try to encourage diversity, but they don't necessarily have the critical thinking of saying, well, what is this stuff that somebody would be really good at? Are you an individual contributor and you can do things really well, like on your own? Are you a team manager? Can you manage people? Is that even something you're good at? Or are you just better kind of doing things on your own? And I'd say, they don't do a great job of that necessarily always, in the sense of being able to line up people based on what they're really passionate about and what they're good at. So I'd say, again, those are still things that are evolving depending on which sort of organization you're talking to. But I would say, diversity for me is not, it's the means to the end of better work and better fulfillment for the employees, right? And while it's certainly something we should be looking at and encouraging, it's different for different businesses, for different categories and different, sort of cultures. True. Of who you're marketing to, even that maybe diversity isn't necessarily the thing for you, as unpopular as that may sound, because your business is so narrow focused on a certain contingent or a group. But like, that's the part for me where like, I think you just have to be intellectually honest about what's happening there, but also very transparent about where you think, you really need, where your business needs are.
Well said on that. This is a question that coming up next. I was thinking about it. I had to think back to when I graduated from college, like some of the companies I was applying for. Now, I want to let the listeners know you work for one of the largest sports agencies. Now, Octagon. I need to know, how was it working for Octagon as the EVP of digital? Like, that was one of the companies I was applying for right out of college. I was a marketing major myself, right? Business management and marketing. And Octagon, I fell in love with it. It was an amazing. I went through several interviews at Octagon, but I didn't get the position itself. But they kept me on. They kept on bringing me back, for more interviews. And I was like, please, Octagon, say yes, say yes. It looks so fun. It just looks so fun. Like, so what did like your job, like what it consist of, and like what was like the biggest accomplishment working at Octagon?
Yeah. Octagon is a great place. Like I'd say, I had the good fortune kind of in the middle of that pandemic to be able to say, okay, well, like here's a sports agency that's looking to kind of evolve. Sports at the time, you remember, weren't a thing, right? Like we couldn't have teams. And so there was a bit of an urgency, right? Of like, we got to figure out this digital thing. We got to figure out some form of hybrid, virtual. Metaverse wasn't a thing at that time. It bubbled up and left, probably in the last year. But, there was a lot of discussion around like, well, what can we be doing to kind of just better, provide that sort of a holistic sort of an experience. So in my time at Octagon, which I got to meet with some brilliant minds that have worked for decades with the leagues and the teams, which I had never worked with really in any meaningful capacity. I was mostly working with brands from that perspective. So I went into Octagon with the mindset of, I'm going to learn because there's a lot I don't know about sponsorship. I'm a brand marketer and an advertiser and a technology sort of a person, but how does sponsorship work? So that was one of the big things that I kind of went in and was pretty honest on like, hey, I'm going to learn this, but I'm going to try to help build the team and kind of advance the structure. So in my time there, what started off as, hey, can you be kind of the digital and strategy lead kind of grew out into a much broader sort of a role. So, globally for digital sorts of needs, I was the head for that. But within the US, I was the strategy lead. And that included 5 different groups. So there was the sponsorship strategy team, which is a bunch of brilliant minds that look at how you value your investment with what you're going to be doing. Should you be doing things with PGA? Should you be looking at, the NBA based on what your brand and business values are and kind of looking at the investment side of it. So that was the sponsorship strategy team. There was a digital team that was 2 different teams, but we integrated. There was an influencer team and a digital media team that is kind of the second largest sort of a group there. So digital strategy and sponsorship strategy. We created a planning group in my time there. So, creative planning, how do you kind of look at a customer journey and what people care about and how you ultimately create the work? So creative planning was the third group. There was a technology group that was kind of product development. How do you kind of build out the customer experience, the user experience, predominantly around experiences? So like if you're doing a photo booth or things like that, how does that tech sort of work there? And the last group was a CRM group that was responsible for things like registration, getting people to actually show up to events and ultimately buy and purchase through the process. So that was going back to some of my roots in direct marketing, and I was happy to kind of help oversee that group as well on kind of how you drive sort of user sort of conversion on that perspective. So again, got to work across a lot of different, brands, leagues, teams, a huge diversity of work there.
Yeah, I was going to say diversity definitely was diverse.
Yeah, absolutely. And the teams were great. The organization was probably the first one that I've joined where I remember, I think my first month in, they were saying something like Ramadan's around the corner and we'd like to wish our Muslim employees, a happy Ramadan. And I'm like, wow, okay, this is the first time I've actually seen this in a corporate structure. So it was great to see that sort of a focus on it, not just for the fact that the employees were diverse, but, the talent that they represented, athletes and things like that had different.
Yeah, true. That is true.
Yeah, so I'd say, the emphasis on it was certainly great. And it was kind of the way that things worked, for sure.
Mm-hmm. And that's why Octagon still to this day, hands down, right? I when I saw that on your bio, I was like, oh my gosh. I always wanted to talk to someone on the inside and be like, look, just tell me how it is, man. It's like a secret society at Octagon. Or like Diageo, another company that you gotta find your way in. But one of my last questions to you is this: any advice for any of our listeners, about how to follow your career path?
Yeah, I'd say, like I probably said a couple of times before, my career has been a combination of design and default, right? Sometimes it was just having the good fortune of being in the right place at the right time. But the one thing that's probably stayed consistent for me is, and I'd say, people that are from minority sort of upbringings, you have this desire to kind of stay sharp and to be driven because you have to perform. And nothing is handed to you, right? In that perspective. And I'd say having the right amount of paranoia, curiosity, and drive and ambition is probably a good vector for success, right? And being honest with yourself on kind of what are the things that really excite you and get you moving. Because it's not about doing 20 different things. It's about doing the right 5. Right.
Let's go. Come on. Drop a gem right at the end of this. Come on. Yeah, you dropping it right now. You dropping a whole lot of stuff. I'm picking it up, and I hope the listeners are as well too. Come on now.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, it is about, like, we're headed into a world where technologically too, when you look at digital and you look at marketing, everybody's headed for parity, right? Like, everybody will have the same stuff in the cloud. Everybody will have the same technology. Everyone will have the same sophistication. And AI is a whole nother threat that's looming, right? Around, like, what do we need people for versus machines? And I'd say, again, humans are very creative, beings, right? So for us, we've got to double down on the things that we're really great at, right? So it is about being able to be curious, to be humble, to be a learner, and to be able to say, okay, well, now I can take this thing and I can connect it to this other thing in a way that hadn't been done before. In that perspective. And that's really the root of any creativity, right? It doesn't mean that it has to be revelatory. It just has to be something that's done in a way that hasn't been done before. And that's where human innovation has always, been there. And I'd say, diversity and all of these other pieces that come up in corporate culture, they're rooted in the desire, again, for organizations to try to grow. And from that perspective, people with different perspectives will always have an advantage, in my opinion. To be able to bring something fresh, to be able to bring something new that the mass culture hasn't seen before. So I'd say use those tools as not a detriment, but a benefit and an advantage to do something that hasn't been done before. And wow them with your brilliance.
Only way to do it. Azher, thank you so much for just being on the show today and kind of expressing to our listeners, talking about your journey and how you had to find your identity, from finding your identity, going to school and saying, at school I could do it, but I'd rather do this, convincing your mom at the time that it was going to work out, versus, being like following protocol and being, look, I'm going to be a doctor no matter what, mom. I think that your story is definitely unique and definitely very beautiful to kind of hear and listen to, and just your experience, working at all these companies, and just what you shared about Octagon as a company, seeing like acknowledging different cultures. That's what the world should look like, and that's what it needs to look like. And having individuals like you at the forefront, leading a lot of diverse teams, it definitely is going to look like that. So again, Azher, thank you so much for being a part of the show.
Thank you.
And I want to let the listeners know, if you want to hear more inspirational stories like Azher, please check us out on ZakaConnect.com. Follow our social at Zaka Connect, and follow our feed, Zaka, wherever you listen to your podcast.